The night Callum stood at the podium and called his wife the most patient woman he'd ever known. She was holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched, and the woman he'd been sleeping with for 8 months was seated 3 tables to her left. Nobody clapped louder than his father. Nora Callum Ashford, 37-year-old wife of Callum Ashford and founder of Vale Interiors, one of Canada's most celebrated architectural design firms, stood in the banquet hall of the Fairmont Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, wearing a midnight blue dress she'd chosen because Callum once said it made her look understated. She'd taken that as a compliment for years. She understood now it was a preference. The event was the Ontario Business Excellence Gala. Callum, 41, senior partner at Birchfield & Cole Legal Group, had been nominated for the Business Integrity Award. His firm handled commercial real estate disputes, the kind that occasionally crossed Nora's desk under a different name. That detail mattered. It would matter more before the night was over. Callum's father, Douglas Ashford, 68, sat at the head of their table with the particular satisfaction of a man who believed his family had assembled correctly. He had flown in from Halifax. He had already told 4 separate people at the table that his son's firm had recently secured a contract with Vale Interiors, the most sought-after design consultancy in the country, and that it was entirely because of Callum's reputation. They only work with the best, Douglas had said, not quietly, cutting into his salmon. Vale doesn't take on just any firm. Their founder, nobody knows who she is, but the work speaks for itself, and they chose Birchfield. They chose my son. Nora had lifted her champagne glass. She had not corrected him. She had built Vale Interiors 11 years ago out of a rented office in the Glebe neighborhood with 2 employees and 1 client who paid her in installments. She ran it under her maiden name. Vile was a truncation of her mother's surname, Vilinski, because when she'd told Callum she was starting a firm, he'd suggested she keep the ambition realistic. She had not fought him on it. She had simply gone quiet, driven to the office the next morning, and built something he could not have imagined. She was its sole owner. She had never told him. That wasn't the hard part to understand. The hard part? The part she would turn over in her mind for months afterward, was that she hadn't kept it secret out of strategy. Not at first. She'd kept it secret because every time she started to tell him, something in his face would shift, and she would calculate the cost of the conversation, and she would decide it wasn't worth it that night. Then 8 months became a year. Then 3 years. Then the firm was acquired, partially, a minority stake, by a Toronto investment group, and her name appeared briefly in a Financial Post sidebar as the anonymous co-founder. And Callum read that article on his iPad over breakfast and said, whoever she is, she must be ruthless. And Nora had said, probably, and poured him more coffee. She had her own reasons for staying. A therapist had once tried to name them for her, and Nora had stopped going to that therapist. It wasn't denial. It was something more like inertia, the weight of a life assembled piece by piece, the difficulty of dismantling it without grief. But the grief had arrived anyway. It arrived in a phone notification on a Tuesday in February. Nora had been in a client meeting when her assistant Simone forwarded her an email that had been sent to Vale's general inquiry address. The email was from a woman named Jade Reimer, 29, a junior associate at a competing firm. It was addressed to whoever handles vendor partnerships. It was professional, efficient, and contained in its signature line a personal cell number, and below that, in small italic font, for Callum, I'll be at the gala. Table 12. Simone had flagged it as spam. She hadn't recognized the name. Nora had recognized the name immediately. She had seen it in the background of a photo on Callum's phone 6 weeks earlier, a photo he'd minimized too quickly when she walked in. She had not said anything then. She had filed it. She was at her core a woman who gathered information before she acted. She did not confront Callum. She hired a private investigator, a quiet, thorough woman named Dee Lachance, who worked out of Gatineau and came recommended by a lawyer friend. 3 weeks later, Dee Lachance delivered a folder. Nora sat in her car in the Vale parking garage and read through it, receipts from the Andaz Ottawa. Screenshots of messages retrieved through methods Nora chose not to examine too closely. A confirmed timeline spanning 8 months. She sat in the car for 45 minutes. Then she went upstairs and approved 3 client proposals, finalized a hire, and called her daughter's school about a Thursday pickup conflict. She did not cry until she was home alone at midnight, standing in the kitchen in her coat, and then only briefly. She allowed herself that. She called her sister Bryn the next morning. "How are you doing?" Bryn asked. "I'm working on something," Nora said. "That's not what I asked." "I know." There was a pause. "Is it over?" Bryn asked quietly. Nora looked out the kitchen window at the canal, still frozen in late February. "I think it has been for a while," she said. "I just needed to see it clearly." She had seen it clearly. The gala was 3 weeks away. Callum had asked her to attend as his guest, and she had said yes, and she had confirmed the reservation, and she had bought the midnight blue dress because she'd thought, briefly with some old stubborn instinct, that she might try. That maybe the folder was a reason to fight. But she had read the messages. She knew the difference between a mistake and a decision. Jade Reimer had been a decision repeated. Over 8 months in hotel rooms, Callum expensed to client entertainment. Nora made her own decision. The week before the gala, Birchfield & Cole received formal notice from Vale Interiors that their partnership contract was under review. The notice cited a clause in the original agreement related to conflicts of interest and professional conduct. A clause Nora had insisted on including when the contract was drafted, over the mild objection of Birchfield's own legal team, who called it unusual. Callum had not been involved in the Vale account. He didn't know who at the firm handled it. He mentioned the notice at dinner with mild irritation, the way he mentioned traffic. Vale's being difficult, he said, scrolling his phone. Legal's looking at it. That's too bad, Nora said. She had also, in the same week, scheduled a meeting with her own legal team, separate, personal, and asked them to begin drafting separation documents. She told them not to file anything yet. She wanted to choose the timing herself. The night of the gala, she let Douglas Ashford talk. She watched him lean toward the couple across the table, explaining the Vale connection, explaining Callum's reputation, explaining what it meant to work with a firm of that caliber. He used the word caliber 3 times. He was proud in the uncomplicated way of men who had never been required to be otherwise. Callum, for his part, looked well. He had ordered the beef. He told a story about a courthouse moment that made the table laugh. He touched Nora's shoulder once, absently, the way you touch a wall to steady yourself, on stairs. She noted Jade Reimer at table 12. Young, attractive, careful not to look at their table. Nora thought briefly about the energy that must require, then she thought about other things. The award presentation began at 9 p.m. Callum was called to the podium at 9:22. He adjusted the microphone with the ease of a man who was comfortable being looked at. He thanked his partners. He thanked his clients. He thanked Nora, the most patient woman I've ever known. And the room made a warm sound, the sound rooms make when they hear what they expect. Nora smiled at the correct moment. After the presentation, during the cocktail portion of the evening, a man approached their table and extended his hand to Douglas. His name was Reed Calloway, 55, a managing partner at the Toronto investment group that held a minority stake in Vale Interiors. He was not supposed to be at this table. He had been placed at table 9, but he had seen Nora from across the room and walked over because they had a board meeting the following Tuesday, and there was a question about the spring collection launch he wanted to clarify. "Nora," he said warmly, "I didn't know you'd be here. I didn't know you would either," she said. He shook her hand, then glanced at Callum. "Your wife is extraordinary," he said. "What she's built at Vale. I've been in this industry for 30 years and I haven't seen instincts like hers." Callum looked at Reed, then at Nora. "I'm sorry," Callum said, with the specific politeness of someone recalibrating. "What's your connection to Nora?" Reed paused. He was a man with good social antennae. He felt the pause in the room. "I'm on the board," he said, "of Vale Interiors, a beat. Nora founded it," Reed said. The table went quiet in the way tables do when everyone suddenly understands that they have been part of a conversation they didn't know was happening. Douglas Ashford set down his drink. Callum turned to look at Nora with an expression she had imagined many times, and which was in the actual moment more complicated than she'd expected. Not just shock, something underneath it, a rearrangement, a rapid private accounting of how many times he had spoken about Vale in front of her, how many times she had listened, what her silence had cost and what it had been. "You're the founder," Callum said, "not a question. Something flatter." "I have been," Nora said, "for 11 years. Douglas said something, she didn't fully catch it, something with the word why, and she turned to Tim gently. "The contract your son's firm received from Vale," she said, "is under review. There's a conduct clause. It'll likely be terminated next week." She said it the way she delivered most difficult information, clearly, without cruelty, without theatre. Reed Calloway, to his credit, had gone very still. Callum's jaw moved. No sound came out. "I want to be clear," Nora said, and she was speaking now to the table, but also in some way, only to Callum. "It's not personal. It's a contractual matter. The clause was always there." She picked up her clutch. She took a breath that felt longer than it probably looked. "I put it in the contract," she said, "because I knew that business and character aren't separate things. They only look separate from a distance." She said good evening to Reed. She nodded once to Douglas. She looked at Callum, not with anger, because the anger had already moved through her and left. Just looked at him the way you look at a place you lived for a long time when you know you won't be coming back to it. Then she walked across the Fairmont ballroom, past the chandeliers and the sound of the last speeches, through the grand lobby with its marble floors and its smell of cedar and wool coats, and out through the front doors into the February dark. The canal was lit up in the distance. The air was cold in the good Canadian way, the kind that clears the head. Bryn was waiting with the car at the bottom of the steps, heater on, a travel mug of tea and the cup holder on the passenger side. "How'd it go?" Bryn asked. Nora got in. She pulled the door shut. She wrapped both hands around the travel mug. "The way it needed to," she said. Bryn merged onto Colonel By Drive without another word. The city moved past the windows, the Rideau, the old buildings, the lights on the ice below. Nora did not cry. She had already done that, in February, in her kitchen alone. She had given herself 45 minutes, and then she had gone upstairs and done her work. She thought about the 11 years it had taken to build something nobody could take away. She thought about the Tuesday morning after Callum had called her ambition unrealistic, and how she'd driven to that rented office in the Glebe, and how the heater hadn't worked, and how she'd wrapped a scarf around her shoulders and opened her laptop anyway. She thought about quietness, how it is not the same thing as weakness, how it is sometimes the room you give yourself to think clearly, to prepare, to decide. She had been quiet for a long time. She wasn't anymore.